Welcome to Enabling Communities to Grow the Internet. In this session, we'll be talking about some of the amazing work our community has been doing to grow the Internet in the Americas. My name is Mark Buell, and I'm the Regional Vice President for North America. Before we get started, one really quick housekeeping item. We'll be taking questions at the end of the talk, so please don't be shy. Post your comments and questions throughout the session in the chat window, and we'll get to them after everyone's done speaking. Community-driven connectivity solutions like community networks are a sustainable and low-cost alternative to traditional internet service providers for many parts of the world. They're the result of communities coming together to build and maintain internet infrastructure and to connect on their own terms. Today, we're joined by three community leaders to talk about their work with community networks in the Americas. Marcelo Saldanha from Brazil, Monica Sanders from the United States, and Burt from Hawaii. They will each tell their stories of bringing connectivity to their communities. I'd like to ask Marcelo to start us off with his work in Brazil.
Okay, Mark, thanks. And hi, everybody. Good night. And I want to share some experience here in Brazil that we are having, such as capacity building in regulatory process and introductions to CNs, to community networks, and how the telecom regulatory scenario is here in Brazil. And the last year, with the support from NISA, we created the first course for community networks, NGOs, and activists to understand the regulatory process. The course is built with some peculiar and specific issues about the regulatory process in Brazil that it's difficult to almost communities here in Brazil to understand and to access the site of the regulatory entity that's Anatel here in Brazil. And the course have this objective to make these laces out and to facilitate, to make it more easy to understand how each community can ask for the license or the exception for the license also, license exempt. And here in Brazil, we work with about 18 people from almost 12 communities with this in this course. And for now, we have about 5 communities getting not only the license, because the license they already got in the course, but now we are experienced to the last mile of this trajectory, that is to get license spectrum. And about more 30 days, we will have the answer from Anatel for these spectrum licenses, and then we will close the objectives of the course that we beginning in the last year. All the communities passing through all the process to understand each site and procedure that it's necessary to get the license. It's about 10 procedures to get the license here in Brazil, but it's like a checklist. Only following the checklist we get the licensing and all the steps to get the spectrum from the beginning to the end of the checklist. And another issue that we are working since 2019, it's to create another course to make more easy the understanding of how the community network works. Because we have a lot of communities here in Brazil searching for solutions to resolve the problem of the digital exclusion. And but they didn't know how to solve these problems. And even they have the information about community networks, it's only a superficial information that they have. And we are we built this course to make more easy to understand all the responsibilities, all the steps, since the technical issues from the legal issues and the management issues about community networks, because they need to understand that the self-management and the sustainability of the community networks precedes the mobilization, the social mobilization in the community, to understand all these steps that I told, and how to build the project that will make possible not only to fundraising the community network, but to show for other entities that could help the community networks. And the objectives of this course and the results of this course, it's very interesting. Since 2019, we capacity about 20 communities represented in the courses. From Bahia, we have Comissão Pastoral da Terra. I don't know if the translation, but it's an organization of rural communities, and they are very engaged politically also. And the course is making fruits in this region. One part of the commission already got some resources, and they are planning to start the building of 5 community networks in Bahia. And this is a great thing. They search for us before implementing the networks to understand all the steps they need to run and to build the community networks with this awareness of the responsibilities that they will assume. And for last, here in Brazil, we have since 2010, we are articulating doing political incidents to make a better regulatory scenario and public policy for CNs. And what's happened in telecom, what's good happened in telecom regulation here in Brazil? Since 2013, we have a license that allows community networks to exist legally. It's a great thing, because before that, all the things that we done here, it's near about a criminal action. But in 2013, we get this first license, and in 2017, we get the license exempt that it's amplify all the possibilities that everyone and every community could create your own community network with a more easy way, because license exempt, the process is very easy to conclude. The problem today with community network is how to use the spectrum and other things that the resources. It's difficult because here in Brazil, we don't have any public policy to fundraising or to stimulate community networks. A little things that we have here is not enough to accomplish and to resolve the big problem that we have here in Brazil, about 50% of the households disconnected from fixed broadband internet with quality. And what kind of policy we have today for digital inclusion and access? We have the program Wi-Fi Brazil that we are discussing with the Minister of Communication to have a more strategic and synergic way to join this policy with community networks. And last week we had a conversation with the Minister of Communication and with Anatel to understand how these policies and another policy from Anatel, it's the backhaul access for community networks, and then we're discussing how we can arrange all these initiatives and these policies with community network. And for the future, we are talking about how to reduce the cost to get spectrum license, because we need to reduce more these values, resolving some problems about homologated equipment, because here in Brazil, if we change the firmware of the equipment, we incur in some sanction with Anatel if they get this kind of equipment using in community networks. And I think we have now here in Brazil the question about the FUST, that's the Universalization Fund for Telecommunication Services, that the next year probably we will get this fund operation. And we're already mobilizing the communities and the civil society organizations to send projects for this fund and the project about community networks. And thanks, Mark, for the opportunity to talk about here the things here that occur in Brazil.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting work. Next up, Monica, would you like to talk to us about what you're up to?
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Marcelo, for talking about social mobilization and social cohesion, because that's going to come up as we talk about what we're doing here in Washington, D.C. So broadly, we are looking at how we can work with communities on building networks. And for the past 2 years, we've been deeply involved in a community in Baltimore, West Baltimore, called Sandtown. If any of you all are familiar with the television show The Wire, this is the neighborhood where a lot of those scenes took place. So when we talk about divestment, we talk about challenges to infrastructure and challenges to access to public service of any kind, this is the template neighborhood for that kind of divestment. But it's also a great template neighborhood because of the sheer level of optimism of the people in the neighborhood to want to participate in this project. So we first became aware of Jonathan Moore, who's our community lead, who runs an organization called Rowdy Orbit, back in 2019. He was interested in finding ways to build internet infrastructure in his community that could accomplish a couple of things. He didn't want just the hard infrastructure. He wanted economic mobility. He wanted more social connection in the neighborhood. Like many of us who perhaps grew up in a real neighborhood, which is hard now because many of us live in apartments and sort of like, isolated communities who grew up with connections to other people in the community. He wanted a way to build that social cohesion back, which when you think about all of these things that are difficult to measure, right? We can measure how many nodes or meshes we have. We can't measure community connectivity. It could have been a challenge, but that was one of the things that made it attractive to the Internet Society and to the Council in DC, was it was such a holistic approach to doing this. So how to begin when you have such a challenge? So what we did was we started with a small training grant from the larger Internet Society in 2019, and we taught people from Jonathan's organization, as well as some youth from the community, a group of teenagers who, I'll put this in lessons learned. I find if you want parents and other people to get engaged, teach young people about it, and they will infect everybody else in the community. We taught them how to configure and build the networks. It was over a weekend at American University, and the decision was made to donate that training equipment to the community to set up the first node. We did that in concert with a charter school called New Song. And that was our first node. Some of you all who might have been following this project or following the news, the day that the quote unquote internet went on in Baltimore, the Baltimore Sun and NBC Nightly News followed the program. And here's the reason why it made news. It was intentional that there was no fiber line brought into that neighborhood. Per what I was talking about, it being the scene of where the wire took place, there was a policy decision not to provide internet services to that part of Baltimore. And so for us, this community to have overcome that intentional obstacle to access was a big moment in Baltimore, as well as a model for how we would handle these kinds of things in other urban areas in the United States. Okay, so it was the first time that a big chunk of the city had high quality Wi-Fi access. From there, as soon as you get some good media coverage, word starts to spread. We did some more trainings. What's nice is more partners from the community came on board. A group called Elevate Baltimore, which is an anti-poverty group, but their mission broadly covers anything that's anti-poverty, and so they link high-quality access to public service and civic participation in poverty eradication, came on board. The United Way of Central Maryland, City of Refuge, and Empower, which are two other groups that were looking at doing community networks, decided to join forces with Rowdy Orbit and ISOC. And what that did for us was helped us to get more nodes up so much faster. It went from one node at this New Song Community Center to one on the steeple of a church, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, which is being remodeled for other purposes. Now the MedStar hospitals in Baltimore have offered up their tall buildings as potential locations for more meshes for the same group of people. So now we've gone from, we have this one lights on, Wi-Fi on project at a charter school in Baltimore to 6 different nodes. And then we have a small mesh that is in a neighborhood called Brooklyn within Baltimore. And we got one home that was a 3-story home on a hill. So it's a perfect place to put up a node. If any of you are familiar with Althea, it's a similar concept. Like one person in the community hosts the actual node and everybody pays into it and deals with the maintenance of it. So going back to this desire for social cohesion, now we've got like a block of people who have created and are maintaining their own node and participating and reaping the benefits of it. And what that has done is now we've got 5 homes with about 25 people connected to a private mesh. So in terms of where we started, this desire to build infrastructure, but can we build some social cohesion back and really some positive experiences in this neighborhood, which is known for something that isn't really reflective of the most positive aspects of it, and certainly isn't known as a hub of digital entrepreneurship and high quality internet services, right? But that's part of changing the narrative because we still don't have a fiber line into West Baltimore. West Baltimore is getting connected by virtue of these community networks, right? So where we're at now, we are looking at diversifying funding. So all of this started before the ideas of digital equity and the digital divide became popular. Because in 2019, this was in public discourse, but there wasn't a lot of funding for it. So we know that in the United States, there's some federal government funding. There are many other nonprofits beyond the Internet Society that are interested in funding internet infrastructure, that are interested in community networks. So the next move for Mr. Moore and his partners are to diversify their funding and to continue building these networks. One of the challenges that they had that might end up being a positive is that a lot of times when you're doing community networks, as many of you may know, I am back. I just got a message saying something went wrong and I was kicked out of the meeting. I think I was about to talk about political instability. So in 2019, Baltimore didn't have a mayor and it didn't have a federal representative, and the state rep was not invested in that neighborhood. So there was basically no political representation when we began this project. A lot of times when you're doing this, and you talked about regulations, Marcelo, is you want to interact with the elected official, do some advocacy and lobbying around having the right regulatory environment for what you were doing. There was no one there to receive any advocacy when we began this. So it was one of those, we're going to do it, and this will lay the groundwork for what the regulations could and should look like, both at the state level and the federal level. And so now what's taken place is Baltimore has elected progressive in the broad sense of the term, not in the political sense of the term, young mayor who's really interested in increasing high quality broadband and access generally in the city. They also have a position called a chief resilience officer who's looking at all the themes surrounding resilience, social cohesion, access to broadband, access to civic participation that's in place. And they have been reaching out to the partners in this community network group to find out how they can increase some of these networks, but then also potentially work with the cable providers to at least get a non-competitive route to expanding broadband reach in the neighborhood. So that's where we're at now. So lessons learned that from this is that I can say personally, when I started this project, if you ask me what's a good place for a community network, I would be thinking in terms of physical structure and geography. I would be looking for a certain kind of weather, certain kind of buildings. And what I learned from this is that the buy-in of the community and the intellectual engagement of the community is just as important as the geography of it. And the other piece of it is that we have been learning and continue to learn from Jonathan Moore and Elevate in particular, is just how many aspects society, and Baltimore being a microcosm of it, are attached to internet access, and how many positive net gains can be done from this. Because since he started, the teams that are doing the installs now are made up of returning citizens. They're made up of teenagers who need some sort of job training that otherwise would not have access to this. And they're increasingly made up of women who were essential workers that were forced out of it because of the pandemic, now have employment and the possibility of, high-tech training, but for what started as a community network project. And all of that is because of the sheer initiative of the people who live there. So there's some, hard what we thought it was going to be when we started, and the things that we've learned now that we've finished. And then what's next is, now that we do have access to political stakeholders, is looking into some regulatory and advocacy trainings, that there's an environment for it now. So thank you all for having me. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the project, and I will turn it back over to you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. I love the idea of the human part of the network being the real crux of it all. That's great. Next up, Burt Lum from Hawaii. Burt. You're on mute, Burt.
Okay, I found the mute button. I want to thank Internet Society. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Marcelo and Monica, as panelists. I learned a lot just from what you folks just shared. I learned a couple of new terms I should use in my vocabulary, like social cohesion and social mobility. We come from a little different perspective, and for those that might not, know exactly where Hawaii might be, we're in the middle of the Pacific, about 2,000 miles away from, the continental U.S. and Asia is another 2,500 miles away. So we're pretty isolated. We're here in the middle, and like Monica was saying, I got involved with this whole broadband effort, in 2018, and back then, everybody was paying attention to other things, and the pandemic was really kind of what brought attention to broadband and things like digital equity. I also must give you some background. So my role here in Hawaii is the broadband strategy officer. I'm here in the state of Hawaii. I work for the state. I am part of the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. I also helped found the ISOC chapter here in Hawaii, and I say this because it's a real important pathway that I've taken. When I first started, as I mentioned, there wasn't a whole lot of money. There wasn't a whole lot of attention in terms of broadband. Everybody felt that broadband was being provided by the carrier, so why worry about it? and when I got involved, I was kind of focusing on some big projects, like trying to get some money for a cable landing, which I was unsuccessful. and then as I went down the path of looking at establishing the Hawaii chapter for the Internet Society, Mark invited me to a conference up in Inuvik, which is up in the Arctic Circle, and it was the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. And at that summit, he and I were chatting about community networks and rural communities, and the idea of maybe doing an Indigenous Connectivity Summit here in Hawaii was brought to my attention, and given me the challenge of if we were to do it in Hawaii, where would we actually do a community network? Because that was part of the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. And at that time, there weren't any community networks here in Hawaii. So based on, what I considered the parameters for establishing a community network, being that it was an Indigenous Connectivity Summit, what I was looking for was whether it was Native Hawaiian, whether it was on an area that would be pretty self-contained and managed. If there were people within the community that would be interested in managing it and keeping it sustained beyond the implementation of the community network, whether there was actual fiber connections there, was there the ability to have some degree of backhaul. And I wanted it to be on Oahu because that's where I live, so I can actually be an active participant in making sure that the project could unfold. We have other major islands here in the chain, and it would have been difficult for me to go fly back and forth if we chose to do it, this initial project on, let's say, Maui or the Big Island. So we did it on Oahu, and we found the location. It is called Pu'uhonua or Waimanalo, and this was in 2019. And why this is important is because not only was it the first community network, and it was an Indigenous community, it was it is headed by a couple of folks, Pampikana Hele and Brandon Maka'ava, and when I first met with them, they really got on the bandwagon fast. They realized that, given this technology, they could enable their community to be much more active participants in the 21st century. And their location is up against the foothills of the Ko'olau Mountains, and they typically, in this community, aren't going to get fiber run to their home. They were previously a homeless encampment that was able to move into the foothills by the state allowing them to lease this land that they were able to set up camp on. And over the course of the last 25 years, they've set up a pretty good community up there. And luckily, Hawaiian Telcom actually ran fiber to the end of the property, or to the start of their property. So we worked out all the arrangements for extending the fiber into the property. We had the dates all set. The Internet Society was coming in. We were getting the hardware. We were, one of the logistic challenges that I overcame quickly, because Bumpy said, "No problem. I can trench from the the property line all the way to the community center," and that was all done, by the community taking an active participatory role in making this happen. So it was it was a lot of work, but it was pretty smooth, and it actually accomplished what we wanted to do, which was establish the first community network here in Hawaii. And along with that, we got a couple of great spokespeople for a community network. And again, this is unlike Monica, this was not necessarily as I would, well, maybe it is kind of an impoverished community, but it was something that wasn't ignored because at least Hawaiian Tel did run fiber there, and we were able to accomplish that kind of connectivity. And then the next project I thought would be kind of a fairly straightforward replication of Puhonua Waianae. Waimanalo was Puhonua Waianae, and this is on Oahu. It's a community that is on the west side, and a little bit of background on them is that they are also a homeless community, and they were pretty much living in on the boat harbor by Waianae. And so what the folks over at Waianae did was they came together. They came together as a community, and together through their just sheer force of passion and desire, were able to raise money to purchase some land about 1.5 miles away from where they are located at the boat harbor. So this particular location was another prime example of where a community network, where typically the carriers, Hawaiian Telecom or Charter Cable Company, they wouldn't necessarily run fiber to the home because there are no homes. It's a homeless encampment. And as they move to their new location in what I call Waianae Mauka, which is toward the mountains, it's not going to be your typical home where you have a street address. It's going to be a community. So it would be another example of where a community network would be ideal. And the challenges that we had to make this one happen were overcome pretty straightforwardly. What we did was we needed to raise some money to get Hawaiian Telecom to run some fiber between one of the highways. It was actually Farrington Highway, and it was about 1.5 miles toward along Waianae Valley Road to where this encampment is. And through the force of will from one of our participants in the broadband hui, which I'll share with you what it is, she was able to raise money from philanthropic support, and we raised about $160,000 so that Hawaiian Telecom could run fiber to that location. And then we were able to get a couple of gigabit circuits to enable some airband hardware that the Internet Society provided. So between a couple of philanthropic support, Internet Society and Weinberg Foundation, we were able to raise some money, and we are right now in the current stage of implementing that network. And what we're doing is since the community is in the process of building their what we call little hales, which is a little house. It's like a little A-frame house. They're in the process of building that, so they're still pretty much located down at the boat harbor. So we're looking at setting up one of the gigabit circuits connected to the airband, and then connect that airband to another airband out at the boat harbor, and so get them connected to Wi-Fi connections. And you might be thinking, well, how do we connect the folks down at the boat harbor for them to get access to any of this internet benefit? Well, there are companies here, a nonprofit called Hawaiian Hope, and Hawaiian Hope actually takes refurbished hardware and makes it available at basically no cost. So we have hardware, we have the internet connection, and now we're also expanding this so that people realize that it's all about digital equity. Broadband access is one level of it, but learning the digital literacy part, the computer literacy part, the understanding of the technology once you have access to it. I look at it like it's kind of the democratization of the technology, so that if you can not only get people connected, can you get people the understanding of leveraging this technology so that they can be full participants in the 21st century. So these are some examples, and what's important about the timeline is that if it wasn't for Mark and us meeting him kind of opening my eyes to the whole idea of indigenous connectivity. We started this well before the pandemic, and I look back at it, and it's kind of my sort of crowning achievement to actually have that first establishment. And it's not something that we can look at and say theoretically, this might be a good thing to do. This is something that we actually implemented. So it's an example of how we can continue this work beyond what was done at Pu'uhonua Waianae or Pu'uhonua Waimanalo. Through the Internet Society, we also were introduced to, the idea of FCC making the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum available, and that is being made available to the Native Americans, Native Alaskans, as well as Native Hawaiians. Now, in the case of Hawaii, just to try to make a long story short, there is no federal recognition of Native Hawaiians as a Native American tribe. So I needed to help establish some organization that would be the applicant for 2.5 gigahertz. And since there is federal recognition for the organization of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, we were able to do that. And so the Hawaiian folks at the Hawaiian Homelands, they were able to apply for 2.5 gigahertz. They are also applying for money from the federal government through the NTIA, which is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And they're looking at deploying 2.5 gigahertz throughout Hawaiian Homelands. And so they now have a model for how community networks could be leveraged in indigenous communities, and look at perhaps scaling that across other Hawaiian homelands and Native Hawaiian beneficiaries throughout the state. And another example of how this is potentially expanding beyond our humble start with Pu'uhonua Waimanalo is that the libraries are now another example of where Wi-Fi could be distributed beyond just the people that go to the library. This is people that are in the vicinity of the library. And so the library could be a location for the creation of more community networks that go beyond the physical location of the library. So the library is an example of an institution that's already in the community. They're a trusted resource, and they are already involved with not only literacy from a reading standpoint, but literacy from now can be a part of the digital literacy movement. And to add, they are also recognized by our telehealth community as being a great place for delivery of telehealth services. So again, the library becomes I think it's a pandemic has helped to perhaps even redefine what libraries are able to do. So we're excited about moving that forward. So again, this whole arena of community networks for me at least here at the state and with the support of the Internet Society, we started very humbly, but I can see this effort to look at ways of connecting communities that don't typically fall into the business plan of the commercial telecom companies or the cable companies, and look at what kinds of alternative models could service communities that could benefit from the wireless technologies and the support from the community, and get more of our goals for digital equity achieved through the innovation of these communities, these institutions, to get on board to meet our broadband equity and digital equity goals. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we have, and I'm happy to say that it all started back in 2018, I guess, in Inuvik, and 2019 in Waimanalo, and thanks to the Internet Society for helping to chart that course. And again, Mark, I'm just enjoying this relationship that we have with you. And thanks for having me on the panel, and thanks to our other panelists. And again, I've learned a lot, and we will continue this journey together to achieve these goals that we've set for ourselves. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bert.
Back to you, Mark.
there is some irony to the fact that the community network movement in Hawaii started in the Canadian Arctic under snow, but that's neither here nor there. We don't have any questions in the chat, but each of our speakers, if you have questions for each other, please go ahead. I have one, and it's for each of you. You know, what advice do you have for a chapter that may know of a community or an area that could really use a community network? What's the first thing they should do? And please just go ahead. I'm not going to call on you individually.
Well, I'll just jump in and just quickly say that the key thing that I would look for is a champion. You know, it's one thing to have the resources, have the money, maybe the fiber connection, but if you have a connection, a champion in that community, that is golden. So that's what I would be looking for.
And I just jump in, and then later I have a question for Bert. I'd say, listen, a lot of times when we want to advocate or work with the community, we think we have all the information. Like, we know you're disconnected, you don't have this, you don't have that. Go and listen, don't survey, don't rely on external data. Like, once you find that champion, just sit with them before you do anything else. And you will learn so much about what you actually need to build once you get to the place of building it.
Maybe possible tips here for Burt, for example. In Hawaii, do you have obligations for telcos? Do you have obligations? And the second thing is not on libraries. If you could use schools and other public points like libraries and schools, for example, almost the point is that try to build these points as a point of presence, straight the distance from community networks and the backhaul, for example. Here in Brazil, we are discussing that. We are having some appointments for the resolution of these questions for the next year, but maybe it's an issue that we could do working in Hawaii. And Monica, I understand that you are doing political and regulatory incidents, but using deputies or the parliament. But maybe it's to make these incidents directly in FCC. Maybe it's a good thing. You need to understand more the telecommunication regulation, but it's more easy to make incidents. I just comparing with Brazil, but if the FCC in the United States is more difficult to make incidents, it's a question that you can solve and understand better. And the other thing that I know from the United States is that FCC regulates digital cities and have a fund for that. And the question is the states, that the state wants to liberate digital cities and other kind of connectivities, non-profit connectivities. But maybe it's a tip that you can explore too. This is the two questions.
We have about a minute left, and I understand it's a hard stop. We get kicked out.
Well, I'll take maybe 10 seconds to answer Marcelo's question. So there's, from an obligation standpoint for the carriers, whether it's telecom or cable, they have their business model. They pretty much run it the way they run it. We don't force them to do anything beyond their requirement. And there's regulations, but it's regulated under delivery of cable and telephone service. As far as libraries, it kind of boils down to what they feel their mission is. And with the libraries, our head librarian, she feels her mission is to achieve digital equity in all ways that she can enable. From the school standpoint, they feel like, you know, their students is their main mission. So, you know, they don't want to, I mean, they've told me, Bert, we're not an ISP, so we don't want to, you know, we don't want to get beyond our mission. So I hope that answers your question.
With 10 seconds to spare, and thank you everyone so much. This was very informative and enlightening. Thank you.